I declare to you today that you shall perish.
Yikes.
Yikes is right. Yikes. That sounds really scary. That sounds really terrifying. That sounds like a very, very angry God. This is the kind of passage that leads people to argue that the God of the Old Testament, and this is an incorrect argument, that the God of the Old Testament is a harsh and angry God. The problem with deciding, though, that the God we hear from in Deuteronomy today is an angry God, and the God of the New Testament is a nice, kinder, gentler, friendly God, is actually how Jesus sounds today. He says, if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. Yikes! Yikes. That sounds scary too. It sounds really scary too. So you can't really make the argument that one's angry and one isn't. And the trouble is, we hear these things, and we'd all rather have a kind God, right? A God who doesn't get angry like we do. An angry God sounds kind of like us, and that doesn't sound like God. And so it can become really easy to dismiss passages like these. It can be easy to decide, like, oh, that was kind of scary and weird, but I'm not going to think about that too much. And you can decide that these passages somehow don't count. But I disagree. I think these passages are relevant, very relevant and important for us today. But in order to get past the scariness and extract a lesson from them, we have to really look at the context in which they were written, and then think about our context today and see where we can put those two things together. I actually think that these passages can help us with anger. That very, very common human emotion. I think these passages can help us with anger. With the righteous anger that we can have, that can actually be good, and that kind of mean anger that we can have that is just mean and is not so good. But to understand these passages, we have to actually think about another strange idea, the idea of idols. Idols. So idols and anger, brothers and sisters. Idols and anger, that's where we're going today. Our passage from Deuteronomy talks about making good choices, right? It's all about making good choices. And it can sound like if we make a mistake, if we make any mistake, God's going to whack us. But I think to really understand this passage and where it's flowing from, the context, you have to look at this key section where it says, if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare today that you shall perish. Now, at the time that this was written, the people of Israel lived in a world where people worshipped many, many gods. The people around them in particular were polytheistic. They worshipped multiple different gods. And many of these other gods, at least in the Middle East and the Near East, were represented by idols. Stone or metal carvings of bulls, most typically, but also other kinds of animals, sometimes just a pole, things like that. And this is what the author of Deuteronomy is afraid of at this moment, that the people of Israel will bow down like all the other people around them and worship these other gods. That they'll worship idols and turn away from the God they knew, the God that loved them. These idols, for the people of Israel, got in the way of their ability to actually see God. Actually, physical thing in the way of your ability to see God. If you worship an idol, you're not connecting to God, or you might not be connecting to God. And that is what the author is afraid of. You would have something in between you and God. Now, that also sounds like a worry that's fairly easy to dismiss. We don't worship idols, right? Do we? Actually, I think we do often still love our idols. I think we can be very good at making idols. We may not make them out of stone or clay or metal or wood, but we make them out of other things, and we can make them pretty easily. So let's just take anger. That's a common thing that we all struggle with. Me in particular, struggle with it all my life. And I think that's why Jesus today spends a huge number of verses on anger, not because of me, but because of all the anger that we suffer as humans. And Jesus today doesn't seem to be a fan of anger. He compares anger to murder. However, we actually also know that Jesus wasn't immune to using strong words. And we have the great example of him getting ticked off and overturning all the money changers' tables in the temple and kind of going nuts. So, one way I look at this is that he wasn't opposed to anger that was directed at injustice. Anger, when it alerts us that something is not only wrong, but might actually be unjust, can actually be a good thing. It can give us strength to work against injustice. And that then can become anger in the service of love. What Jesus criticizes today, though, is the way anger can cause us to turn away from each other. And what Jesus says is that you must reconcile. You must not let your anger get in the way of your God-given ability to see people as human. Anger shouldn't get in the way of the truth that everyone, no matter how angry they make us, deserves God's love and deserves our love. Jesus says we must be reconcilers. We must not allow the disagreements that we're always going to have, at home, at church, in our community, in state and national politics. We can't allow those disagreements to cause us to forget that we are all sisters and brothers. Because when we do that, we make idols. In anger, we can make idols out of ourselves. We can decide that we as individuals, or even whatever the we is, families or groups, communities, churches, or whatever, we can decide that we are so important that anybody who disagrees with us is a threat. It's not even worth talking to. We put ourselves in the way of seeing other people. And when we do that, we make ourselves into idols, and we block our ability to see God in each other. In anger, we can turn our ideas into idols. We can decide that whatever ideas we have or things we have in mind or want to do are so good that no other idea is even worth listening to. We can even decide that other ideas just infuriate us. And when we do that, we make our ideas into idols. Because we stop listening to other people. We stop listening to other people that God may be speaking to, and that God may be speaking through just as much as ourselves. When we make idols, when we make our ideas into idols, they block our ability to see God's ideas, which just may be found in other people. And in anger, we can even make our enemies into idols. We can take real live people and turn them into no more than the things they do or the things that they do that we don't like. We can be so angry at people that they become actually the focus of all of our thoughts and efforts, rather than focusing on a loving God and working to create a loving world. So when we do that, when the enemy or the person we disagree with or whatever is the main thing in front of us, we make them into idols. So we humans, I think, very much like to make idols. It seems to be something that is part of us, it's something we struggle with. And in all of these cases, when we make an idol, we block our view of other people, and we block our view of God. And that's not what God's about. Actually, God, when you really look at things, God focused on God. But through Christ, we know that God is actually all about relationships. Through Christ and in Christ, we know that God joined with us. That God entered into a relationship with us that is as close as any relationship that we can have. God, in fact, is all about others. And that's what Jesus is talking about today. When Jesus is asked, what does God ask of us? Jesus turns around and says, how are you being with others? Are you carrying anger when you should be seeking reconciliation? Are you treating others like objects, like idols, and lusting after them when you should be loving and faithful? Are you relying on elaborate oaths or contracts when really you should just be in a good relationship with somebody and treat them honestly and fairly? To make an idol is to turn away from a true relationship. Instead of being with others, instead of being with God, we start to focus on the idol in front of us. And it's hard to avoid doing this. It's hard to avoid doing this. Sometimes I think the best thing we can do is catch ourselves doing this, be aware of our tendency to do this. So it is hard to avoid. But we know that God made us to be in relationship with each other and with God. That is how we are made. That is our true self. We may make idols, but we don't have to worship them. We are made to choose life. A joyous life with others. A joyous life for others. A joyous life with God.